So I'm going to show you what I did with my car and HPTuners to adjust my idle. It will almost die, and then it triggers something called like stall mode or something like that, I think is what it is. And then it will catch the RPMs. But I figured out how to solve that too. So here's where we're at right now before we monkey with anything. So let me go for a quick drive and I'll show you how it stalls. Then I'll show you what I adjusted in HPTuners to actually fix it. So I'm just going to go around the block real quick, and you'll see it's really annoying, especially whenever I first get out of my driveway, you know, making that turn and stuff. It almost stalls, and it makes it, you think the engine's going to die, so you try to give it gas real quick. You just punch the clutch in. It gets all the way down to 500 RPM, and then it triggers some other mode. I think it was called stall mode. So if I'm just driving, punch the clutch. That time it went down to 490 RPM. Driving, punch the clutch. That time it went to 400 RPM, and then it oscillates a little bit. Now it's stabilized about 600 RPM and then coming back up. That is really annoying. It's done that pretty much the whole time I've owned the car. Whenever I got it, it did not have the stock tune in it. It had a Veraram intake, a Corsa catback exhaust, and a custom tune. It had first to fourth turned off and a couple of other things. Obviously fuel air mixture, a couple of other things. See, there it goes again. So it actually got worse whenever I put the turbo kit on it. It got to the point where the RPMs would dip so low the alternator would turn off. It would no longer be putting current out. And so what I ended up doing to fix the alternator is I put a smaller pulley on the alternator, and you can search back through the videos. I've got a video on the alternator. It's actually from a Ford Focus. The alternator pulley is, and I got it for like $6, and that solved the problem with my oil pump. See, the rest of the system, it can function off of the battery, but the oil pump wouldn't spin fast enough, especially when I had that Spartan oil pump. It wouldn't spin fast enough to empty the turbos. So whenever I would do this, and it would dip down, the pump would spin down, and the turbos would fill up with oil. So for about 3 months there, I had to drive it where I was constantly blipping the throttle to keep it from stalling like that. Since I put this other oil pump on there, the cheapy eBay pump, it spin, even at 10 volts, it spins like crazy, so it pumps plenty. But I also have the smaller pulley on it right now, so even when the RPMs dip, that was about 500 RPMs, the volts still stay at 1600 RPM, or 16, I'm sorry, the volts still stay at 14 volts even whenever the RPMs are at 400 or 500. This particular alternator doesn't start making current until the alternator spins over 2000 RPM. So whenever I did my calculations, I found an alternator pulley that would keep the alternator spinning at over 2000 RPM even if I was below 600 RPM. I gotta drive all my ramps just right. So now let me show you which fields I adjusted in HPTuners to adjust my idle. And this will probably apply to things like head and cam swap and things like that. Or if you just don't like where your car idles and you want to idle it somewhere else. Alright guys, so I wanted to take you guys step by step on how I adjusted the idle on my car. You've probably already seen by now, if you're watching this, the video where I did the comparison between a 650 RPM idle and a 700 RPM idle, and the sound difference that made in the cabin with polyurethane mounts. So this is how I adjusted my idle. I actually have a little step-by-step list here I made for myself to keep myself from forgetting this if I need to do this in the future, if I need to adjust it back, if I need to adjust somebody else's vehicle or whatever. So basically, I have a step-by-step idle kind of checklist here. And all of this is going to take place in HPTuners If you go up here and you click this engine button from the home kind of landing page, that's where we're going to do all of our work. Then you're going to go to this idle tab, and I try to do my best to notate that where I found it. So idle, RPM, base set point, and then base. So if I go idle, RPM, base set point would be this title right here, and then base would be the tab where we're actually going to make the adjustments. So since that's step number one, let's go ahead and jump in. This is the actual set point for the versus the cooling temperature. So what I did is everything above this kind of 100-degree mark right here, I set it to what I wanted. I'll go over in a second why I have it set to 705. I believe, based on what I've seen in the data logs that I've created, that the computer in the car doesn't have enough resolution to fine-tune the idle to 700 RPM, and I'll go over why I believe that. So basically what I did is I took all of these values right here, I set them where I wanted, and then I just kind of made up some reasonable values to smooth it down in this area right here. That was step number one. Step number two, right here, you go to idle, RPM, minimum set point, and VSS. So I believe this is vehicle speed sensor. And again, I just set all of these values to my desired RPM. I believe this table, and don't quote me on this, once you go over 24 miles an hour, it starts to ignore this table. But I'm not 100% familiar with how all of these tables work together, but I did figure out how to change my idle. So this works, and I've been able to duplicate it several times. So next step, idle, RPM, startup, and then park and neutral. So what I found, because my car is a manual 6-speed, these tables actually can be set identically. So that's what I did. Basically, I set anything that was already at 650, and you can see this is what the one was before I changed it. Anything that was set to 650, I changed it to that 705 number, and then I just smoothed everything else down to something reasonable. So you can see it kind of made sense for me to just put it at 705, so that's what I did. But then I just copy and pasted it to this other one. In an auto transmission, you're probably going to have to play with these two tables because in gear and park and neutral are going to act completely different based on engine load. The next thing I did was I set the idle RPM max set point, and then I just set this max number right here. Oops, I apologize, wrong table. Idle RPM max set point. Okay, so this one right here. It was already at 1150, but you might want to think about that because that controls how high the engine will rev whenever it's cold. It's just kind of like a final cap to keep your engine from over revving if you accidentally set something wrong here. Fifth one, sorry, I forgot, I jumped ahead of 4. This adaptive idle minimum reference, I went ahead and set that to 705. I found if I played around with this, it didn't really have an impact, but I did not test it in every corner case that's possible. So I just left it at 705 and it's worked fine for me. Then the next thing I've noticed is you have to actually change your airflow. Because if I command a higher RPM, but I don't tell the engine you can have more air, it ends up kind of oscillating and it ends up fighting itself, and it just doesn't set right. So you have to go to idle, airflow, base running airflow, and then this airflow final minimum. This is the table that I found has the biggest impact whenever I'm adjusting the idle. And you can see on mine, I actually zeroed all of these out. The reason I did that is because there were actually values in here in my original tune, and I could not figure out why they were different. And I tried to adjust first gear and neutral, thinking that's what I needed to adjust at idle, and I couldn't really get any difference. I couldn't make it do what I wanted it to do. Sorry, these are the actual values that were in there. You just take away the negative. And I couldn't really make it do what I wanted it to do. So what I ended up doing was I actually zeroed everything out and then tried to start the car, and then it wouldn't run. I'm like, okay, so something in here actually matters. Then the next thing I did was I set only this one. That didn't do anything. I'm like, okay, that doesn't make sense. So then I tried only neutral, And it worked while I was sitting still and idling. But then the second I moved the car and the speedometer registered a speed, this value no longer worked and it would just die on me. So I was like, okay, let me try this park field right here. So what I did is just copied and pasted in park, and then it started working just perfect. And this reverse makes no difference whatsoever. It's, I guess, as far as the computer is concerned, it's just like any of these other gears. It gets ignored in a manual transmission. So I've been driving it around now for quite some time with all these other values zeroed out. So every time I need to fine-tune my idle, I change it in neutral and park the same, and it works flawlessly. So that is actually what I did to adjust my idle. Now let me go over why I have it set at 705 instead of 700. So here is a data log that I took of my actual car. And you'll notice right here where it says idle desired RPM, it says 704, not 705, even though I have it set at 705. And if you look up here where it's actually, this is the actual engine RPM being recorded, you can see it's hovering around 695, 700, 698, 708. It's hovering around that 704 number, but it spends most of its time between 700 and 710. Now, if I open up another log from an earlier file where I had it set at 700, let's just look at this one real quick. So this one, nope, got to go earlier than that. Sorry, I should have had this file picked out ahead of time. Let's go a little bit further back than that. Yeah, okay, so here you go. Here's one where I set it at 700, and you'll notice it's at 696. And then it actually idles a little bit lower than that. It spends a lot of its time at 690. And I don't really understand why, but I noticed that it was not spending as much time at 700, so I started looking around, and I cannot for the life of me figure out why, even though I have my tune set at, let's go over here, even though I have my tune set at 705, or I'm sorry, even though I had it set at 700 everywhere, no matter what, the desired idle always popped up at 696. So that means it has to be something to deal with how the computer actually works. And I think it's because it doesn't have enough resolution to go in single RPM increments. It's probably got an extra bit or less than a bit in that register in the computer, so that means it can probably only go in 8 RPM increments. So I found out that if I set it at 705, I got 704 in here, and then my idle ran at 700 just the way I wanted it, and it worked perfect. The last thing I want to show you guys right before I let you go is what I did to keep the idle from trying to die on me. I used this table right here, the airflow table, and what I had to do was actually add air to some of the upper RPMs so that it would stop dying and it would drop down to the 700 RPM the way I wanted it to. So I adjusted this row right here. I just added a little bit of air, a little bit of air, a little bit of air to the top side of it, and what it did was that the RPMs fell slower so that it didn't overshoot. The other thing that I did was it started hanging, so I had to flatten out this curve a little bit between the lower RPM and the higher RPM. When I flattened out that curve, everything worked out just the way I wanted it, so everything was perfect from that point on. Okay, here we are after all of the changes that I've made to the idle file. And just listen whenever I drive it and punch the clutch in. So the idle drops slower and then stops right where I want it to. Punch clutch in. It never has a moment where it feels like it's about to die. So one more time. We're idling at a smooth 700. Cabin doesn't resonate as bad. Punch clutch in. Doesn't almost die. See? Stays right at that 700 mark where I wanted. So that helped. That solved two problems for me. It solved the resonance inside the cabin, and it also solved the fact that whenever I punch the clutch in and I'm driving, it